The morning sun cast a soft amber glow over the runway as Flight 709 prepared for departure. The crew moved through their routine with practiced precision, checking every gauge and greeting each passenger. With a smile that masked the monotony of countless journeys before this one, the terminal buzzed with the low murmur of families, saying goodbye, of solo travelers searching for their gates, of announcements echoing through the intercom, reminding everyone of the fragile order that kept the sky safe and predictable. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was calm, peaceful, even as passengers settled into their seats, some clutching paperbacks, others scrolling through phones, some glancing out of the oval windows as ground crew buzzed around the plane like insects in fluorescent vests, working methodically and without haste in seat 17B. A man named Elias Rourke sat quietly, a duffel bag under the seat in front of him, his posture relaxed, his eyes closed, as if listening not to the hum of engines, but to something deeper, some frequency only he could hear. He wore a simple gray sweatshirt, his hair neatly trimmed, and his hands folded gently in his lap. Around him the usual sounds of boarding unfolded. A young couple argued softly about an overhead bag. An elderly woman across the aisle asked a flight attendant for help, buckling her belt, a toddler behind. Elias shrieked with glee at the fold-out tray, and a businessman in the row ahead made a final urgent call, speaking in clipped tones about a delayed contract and impossible deadlines. Overhead compartments slammed shut. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom with a warm welcome and a promise of clear skies for the duration of the flight. As the engines roared to life, the aircraft began its slow crawl toward the runway, the tires humming against the asphalt like distant thunder. Elias opened his eyes, calm and steady. He glanced once at the stewardess completing her final check, then turned to the window, watching the airport fade behind them. A few stray clouds drifted above. Like scattered thoughts, barely noticed, the plane paused at the edge of the runway, waiting for clearance, while inside passengers adjusted their seats, glanced at safety cards, or closed their eyes against the rising hum of anticipation. Then came the final surge, as the engines thundered louder and the plane accelerated down the runway. A blur of motion and power and steel as it left the ground behind, lifting into the sky with practiced grace and ease. The city below shrank away, disappearing behind a patchwork of fields and roads and glinting rooftops, while inside the cabin, people settled in with books, headphones, conversations, and silent thoughts, each trusting in the machine, in the pilots, in the invisible threads of technology and training that held them above the earth. That moment, there was no sign that this flight would be different. No sign that fear would creep into their calm, no hint that fate had placed Elias Rourke among them for a reason not even Elias himself could yet understand. For now, there was only the climb, the steady rise, the faint pressure in their ears, and the illusion that all was and would remain. At 30,000 feet, the sky turned from pale blue to a deeper shade, like an endless ocean turned upside down. The clouds below drifted silently like frozen waves as Flight 709 cruised smoothly through the atmosphere. Passengers relaxed into the rhythm of the flight. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles with carts offering drinks and snacks. While some passengers dozed off beneath thin blankets, others tapped at laptop keys or stared blankly at in-flight screens, lost in the glow of distraction. The pilots in the cockpit were calm, confident professionals watching the instruments, speaking in low tones. The flight so far had been routine, uneventful, until a sudden jolt shook the cabin like a brief gust of wind. No one panicked at first. Turbulence was common, expected. Even the fasten seatbelt sign flickered on, and some passengers looked up from their books or meals, but the flight attendants remained composed, their faces unreadable, trained to reassure them. The second jolt came harder, more violent. A deep groan echoed through the fuselage as the aircraft tilted slightly, not enough to send anything flying, but enough to raise eyebrows and cause glances to shift from screens to windows. The pilot's voice came on, calm but firm, asking passengers to remain seated and buckled as they were adjusting course due to unexpected weather ahead. But the sky outside was clear, no storm, no clouds, no sign of trouble, except for the low tremble that now seemed to grow beneath the floor of the aircraft, like something ancient stirring. Beneath their feet in the cockpit, the situation was changing rapidly. Warning lights blinked to life across the control panel, hydraulic pressure dropping systems failing. In a sequence that made no logical sense, both pilots moved quickly, running through protocols, scanning instruments, but the aircraft was no longer responding to input to the autopilot. Disengaged without command, the stabilizers were not adjusting as they should, and worse, the yoke felt sluggish, like steering through wet cement. The co-pilot muttered under his breath as he tried to reroute power through secondary systems, but even those channels began to blink. Red, the captain reached for the emergency manual overrides, but they too felt disconnected. The plane was not falling, not yet, but it was not flying correctly either, and every second that passed made the pilots more aware that they were no longer in full control of the machine. In the cabin, the vibrations became more noticeable. Tray tables rattled. The toddler who had been laughing earlier now whimpered as his mother held him tight. A few passengers began to whisper to each other, voices rising, questions spreading like cracks across the comm. One of the attendants moved quickly toward the cockpit. Another moved down the aisle, checking belts, offering forced smiles. Hiding the growing dread behind well-trained eyes, the captain's voice returned, now thinner, more strained, asking passengers to stay calm while they worked through a technical issue. That there was no danger at this time, even though his heart was pounding and his hands were gripping the yoke tighter with every passing second. Then seat 17B Elias. Rourke sat still, his eyes open and alert. The vibration, the change in pitch of the engines, the uneven angle of the wings. He recognized these signs from long ago, from darker days when machines failed under pressure in desert skies. He looked down at his feet, flexed his fingers, and reached slowly for the seat back in front of him, not in panic, but in preparation. There was no chaos yet, but it was coming like a wave. He could feel it just beneath the surface, rising and ready to break. Inside the cockpit, the air had changed, thick with tension and sweat, as the pilots moved with increasing urgency. Their voices clipped as they checked systems that refused to respond. Gauges fluctuated wildly, and the flight management display pulsed. With warnings, the aircraft was losing lateral stability. The left wing was dropping ever so slightly, pulling the plane into a slow spiral that neither autopilot nor manual correction could stop. The captain barked commands while the co-pilot scrambled through pages of the emergency checklist, but each attempted fix only seemed to trigger a new set of failures. The plane was no longer following their control. It was gliding under some broken set of parameters, drifting dangerously off its assigned course. In the cabin, passengers were no longer calm. The vibrations had grown into a steady trembling that buzzed through the floor and armrests. Drinks toppled from trays, and overhead bins began to rattle. The fasten seatbelt sign glowed like a warning. In the dark, as voices rose from murmurs to open questions to anxious calls for flight attendants who could no longer hide the truth in their eyes. They moved quickly, trying to soothe, reassure, and stall the inevitable realization that something was terribly wrong. The elderly woman in 18A clutched her rosary, her lips moving silently. The businessman up front, now gripping both armrests, his cell phone long forgotten. The toddler in the rear was now crying, hard-pressed into his mother's chest as she whispered empty comforts. The sense of helplessness rolled through the cabin like a slow fog, creeping into every row, into every Mindelius Rourke. In seat 17B remained still. He watched and listened and felt the aircraft's unnatural motion, the tilt, the tremble, the growing sense of disobedience from a machine that was no longer following orders. He knew this kind of failure not from commercial flight, but from combat zones, from aircraft damaged in the field, held together by instinct and training and desperation. He unbuckled his seatbelt, slowly, calmly ignoring the startled glance from the man seated beside him, and stood steady as the plane groaned again, louder, this time more insistent, as if warning them of what came. Next, he moved toward the front of the plane with the deliberate pace of a man who had walked into danger before, who had heard metal scream and engines fail, and knew that seconds, not minutes, determined survival. A flight attendant stepped in his path, her voice sharp with fear, telling him to sit, but something in his eyes made her step aside. The pilots were now realizing that someone had to take control, and that maybe, just maybe, that someone was not them. Inside the cockpit, Elias found chaos, blinking lights, angry alarms. Two men doing their best but fighting a losing battle. The captain turned to protest, then paused as Elias leaned in, speaking with low urgency, asking for access to the backup panel. One look into Elias's eyes was enough to see this was no ordinary passenger. The captain hesitated, then nodded, stepping back as Elias dropped into the jump seat, his fingers already tracing wires and switches, looking not for what should be, but for what still worked, what could be rerouted, what could be bent back into function with force and instinct and nerve. As The aircraft tilted again, sharper this time, and gasps rippled through the cabin. Elias reached for the panel beneath the console, pulled it open, and began to work not with fear, but with focus, the kind only born from experience. The kind that knew failure was not an option when lives were measured in altitude and seconds. The cockpit lights cast a pale flicker over Elias's hands as he moved with quiet precision. Beneath the instrument panel, the plane had begun to slip further off its heading, and the co-pilot now stood back, unsure whether to intervene or observe. As Elias traced the auxiliary cables and tapped into the analog override tucked behind the main console. A system few commercial pilots had ever needed to use, much less in flight and under failure conditions. He pulled out his multi-tool and carefully stripped a wire, reconnected it to a bypass channel, and muttered under his breath as the internal navigation briefly flickered to life before dimming again. Not enough power. Not yet. The captain watched Elias with a mix of disbelief and hope, trying to keep the aircraft level with the few controls that still responded, while the main systems blinked in and out like dying stars. Elias reached for another conduit, reprogramming a manual feedback loop to redirect power from the onboard diagnostics to the mechanical trim control. If the system could not fly the plane, he would make the plane fly itself with whatever pieces he could wake up and force into cooperation. Outside, the sky remained deceptively calm, vast, and indifferent to the chaos. Inside, while below them, the earth began to rise slowly as the plane descended in a gentle arc that would soon become steep and deadly. If something did not change, the captain announced to the crew that a passenger was assisting under authorization, and ordered all communication lines open to the cabin as they coordinated a silent effort to keep the passengers seated and steady even as the walls seemed to vibrate. Like a giant breath being held to long N, the passenger cabin time stretched. Then people began to realize that no one was coming over the intercom to say it was a false alarm. No apologies were offered. No tray service resumed. They were in it now, together and alone, with the knowledge that their fate rested in the hands of someone who was not supposed to be flying this plane, and yet somehow was. Elias Rourke, a man most had not noticed before now, was becoming the axis upon which their survival might turn. The stewardess, who had blocked his way earlier, now stood guard at the cockpit door, her face pale but firm, her voice steady as she spoke to nervous passengers, explaining as best she could that help was being rendered, that every possible action was being taken, though she had no real understanding of what Elias was doing behind that door, only the unshakable belief that he had to be there and that somehow he belonged in the seat. He now occupied. Elias found the final junction box behind the co-pilot's seat and rerouted the power from one of the generator buses. The aircraft shuddered and dipped briefly before stabilizing, not fully level, but enough to slow the descent, enough to give them time enough to hold on for a few more critical minutes. He gave a brief nod to the captain, who returned it silently, then turned back to his gauges as they now blinked steadily with readings that could finally be trusted with. The trim rebalanced, and the mechanical backup servos responding. Elias took control of the yoke and began to guide the aircraft back to neutral flight. The nose lifted slightly and the tremors reduced. The plane was no longer falling, it was flying again. Not gracefully, not comfortably, but enough to begin a search for safe landing, enough to begin the long, careful descent back to the ground and back to life. The cockpit was quiet now, except for the low hum of essential systems. Slowly returning to life under Elias's guidance, the alarms had faded into silence. And though the aircraft was still wounded, still limping through the sky, it was stable, was flying, and that alone brought a moment of stillness inside the minds of those who had feared the end. Elias gripped the yoke firmly, reading the feedback from the panel as he spoke with calm authority, coordinating with the captain to establish a new flight path to the nearest available airstrip, not a commercial airport, but a military auxiliary field with a long, flat runway, built for emergency landings and rarely used, but perfect for a plane that could no longer guarantee a smooth descent. The captain opened a secure channel to air traffic control and declared an emergency. The voice on the other end crackled with surprise, then snapped into focus, confirming the field and clearing. Nearby airspace, the plane would be alone in its descent, flanked only by silence and cloud cover. Elias adjusted the heading manually, feeling the resistance in the controls, the effort needed for every degree of correction, as though the aircraft was fighting him, not out of malice, but exhaustion, like a great bird with broken wings, doing its best to stay aloft, just long enough to reach the tree's back. In the cabin, the passengers were no longer asking questions. Their fear had settled into a heavy quiet as they watched the attendants moving calmly. Purposefully, as if that calm might somehow anchor them to safety, some people prayed, others stared straight ahead. Some held hands across the aisle, silent promises between strangers. Bound by shared uncertainty, one man wrote a message on a napkin and folded it into his coat. Another woman whispered her daughter's name over and over again, as if the sound alone would protect Hera. Child, a few rows behind Elias, asked in a small voice if they were going to crash. The mother held her child tightly and said no, because someone was flying the plane, someone good, someone who knew what he was doing, and the child looked toward the front where Elias sat unseen, and nodded and said, "Then we will be." Okay, Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, which was now beginning to lower as the plane dipped gently toward its new destination. The auxiliary landing strip was still many miles out, but the worst was behind them, and now it was a matter of keeping the aircraft steady, conserving power, and preparing for the final test, the landing, the most dangerous moment of all, because once the wheels touched the ground, they would have only one chance to slow. Without full hydraulic systems, without standard braking support, it would come down to weight angle and instinct. He asked the captain to assist with the flaps manually, while he adjusted trim and throttle, feeling the aircraft respond with a shudder, then a glide. A descent that felt more like falling in slow motion. The field came into view, dark strip between hills and dry grass, and Elias made small corrections, pulling the nose up, checking the wind, adjusting pitch. The flaps deployed with a groan, and the wheels unlocked with a harsh clank, and the moment was near when everything would depend on what happened next. The cabin was silent. Everyone braced, not because they had been told to, but because they felt it in their bones. The pressure, the weight, the nearness of Earth, and the terrible gravity of hope and fear. Elias took one long breath, held it steady, and began the approach. His eyes steady, his hands firm, the plane a damaged bird held together by knowledge and courage, and something deeper that could not be explained, only felt. The auxiliary field stretched ahead of them like a promise and a warning, flat and narrow. Without the electronic systems of a commercial runway, just painted lines faded by sun and time, and a single control tower, already scrambling emergency vehicles to position. Elias stared through the windshield, his breath, even his hand steady as the aircraft descended with a slow, determined grace. The engine still functioning but weakened, the flaps strained but holding the wind beginning to buffet the sides as the plane met the lower atmosphere with growing resistance and less forgiveness. The co-pilot called out altitude in a firm voice while the captain adjusted the final settings for descent, trusting Elias completely now, no longer questioning the fact that a man who had not stepped into a cockpit in over a decade had brought a failing aircraft back from the edge of disaster, and was now preparing to land it with nothing but half a system and the sheer force of his will. Elias nodded, once acknowledged the altitude reading, and made a final pitch correction, bringing the nose up slightly, aligning the landing gear with the runway as if threading a needle with a steel thread. At 200 miles per hour, the wheels touched down. With a jolt, not smooth, not soft, but solid and controlled, a burst of black smoke rising from the tires as rubber met asphalt, and Elias engaged the manual brakes carefully, gently applying pressure through a secondary circuit he had rigged only minutes earlier. The aircraft shuddered as it rolled the emergency crews flanking the runway in tense silence, waiting for any sign of veering or collapse, but the plane stayed straight, rolling along the center line with grinding determination. The passengers inside pressed into their seats, eyes wide, hearts pounding as the plane finally slowed. The nose dipped slightly, but Elias corrected it. The brakes groaned, the gear held, and after what felt like an eternity, the aircraft came to a full stop near the far end of the runway, the engine spooling down the wind, fading into stillness. The only sound inside the cockpit was a soft exhale from the captain, who reached over and gripped Elias's shoulder. Neither man spoke because there was nothing that needed to be said in that moment. The silence said everything. In the cabin, the silence turned quickly into a wave of applause, not loud or joyful at first, but filled with the rawness of relief. A few passengers cried openly, others simply sat stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened, what they had just survived. Flight attendants moved quickly, opening doors, coordinating with rescue personnel, and ensuring that every soul who had boarded that plane would walk away from it alive, because one man had stood up when no one else could. Elias unbuckled himself, slowly, his back aching, his hands slightly numb, but his mind still sharp. He stepped out of the cockpit into the aisle, where eyes turned toward him wide grateful. Disbelieving, he nodded at no one in particular and began walking down the aisle toward the rear exit, not seeking attention, not needing thanks, simply following the current of his own sense of purpose. And distance outside on the tarmac, the air was hot and dry, and the emergency responders moved in but found nothing left to do. The danger was over, the fire never came, and the smoke was only rubber and tension fading into the summer wind. Elias stepped onto the ground, looked once at the aircraft, then turned away, walking toward the edge of the field as the sun hung low behind him and the shadow of the plane stretched long across the ground like a scar and a memory. The air around the field remained heavy with silence, even as the noise of vehicles and voices returned, slowly building like a tide after a storm. Flight 709 had landed against every odd, with every system strained, and every second stretched thin. By the decisions of a single man who now stood alone at the edge of the runway, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the horizon, while behind him passengers disembarked one by one, their faces marked by disbelief, exhaustion, and awe. Some looked back at the plane, unable to comprehend how it was still in one piece. Others searched the crowd for the man they knew had saved them. But Elias had no interest in standing in the glow of relief or praise. He moved toward the security perimeter quietly, unnoticed by most, ducking under the temporary fencing used for emergency landings and making his way to the nearest gravel road. Beyond the emergency crews, beyond the reporters who had begun to arrive, and even beyond the pilots who still stood by the cockpit door, scanning the crowd, hoping to spot the man who had taken their dying aircraft and brought it home with hands that moved like they remembered the sky itself. Inside the terminal, the passengers who had been bussed in were met with food, water, blankets, and a flood of officials, medical personnel, and journalists, each trying to make sense of what had happened. Interviews began, statements were taken, but again and again the same truth emerged. No one knew how the plane had stayed in the air. No one knew who the man was, only that he had taken control with calm and skill and disappeared the moment wheels hit earth. The captain refused to leave the field. He stood near the nose of the aircraft, speaking softly to technicians. As they examined the damaged systems, fried cables melted, a dozen critical redundancies bypassed or manually rerouted, and none of it made sense until one engineer found the open panel below the console, saw the tool marks, the makeshift connections, the perfect improvisation that had saved hundreds of lives, and he turned to the captain with wide eyes and said, "Whoever did this knew things we don't even train for anymore." Elias walked for several miles under the fading light until he reached a small rest stop, a gas station, mostly empty, except for a tired clerk who barely looked up when Elias entered, bought a bottle of water, and sat outside on the bench, beneath a buzzing neon sign that flickered in the dusk. He drank slowly, stared at the sky, now soft and purple, with dusk, and thought about nothing at all, letting the hum of traffic and the warmth of the bottle in his hand bring him back to a quieter place, a slower rhythm, where nothing needed fixing, and no one was watching. Truck pulled up not long after, and the driver stepped out, stretched his legs, and looked over at Elias with a nod. Elias returned it without words. The man sat down, and they shared a silence between strangers, who would never know what the other carried, the kind of silence that belonged only to those who had seen the edge and stepped back from it without needing to explain back. At the airfield, search teams were now officially trying to identify Elias Rourke, whose name was not on the manifest, whose seat was listed as unoccupied, whose presence had never been registered by the airline or airport systems, and yet had sat at the heart of the aircraft and brought it home with hands steady and quiet as the sky itself, still holding their secret. The sun was gone now, and the stars had begun to appear one by one above the empty stretch of highway where Elias Rourke stood beside the road, his duffel slung over one shoulder. His face quiet as the night around him, he walked without rush, his steps measured not by distance but by memory, each one a soft echo of all the roads he had walked before, from deserts to airstrips to quiet cities where no one knew his name, and that was always the point behind him. Through news reports, interviews, satellite feeds, pilots and experts, all trying to explain what had happened on Flight 709, trying to piece together How a mid-air failure that should have ended in disaster had instead become something close to it. Miracle investigators combed through cockpit data voice recordings, sensor logs, but what they found only deepened the mystery. Because the voice that took control was not listed, the hands that flew the plane left no fingerprints the system showed. Signs of human override, but no credentials, no flight record, no official trace passengers, described him in pieces. A man in gray calm voice, sharp eyes, no panic, just purpose, one said. He moved like someone who had done it 1,000 times. Another said he looked more like a soldier than a pilot. And another said he never once looked afraid, not even when the plane was shaking. Like it might fall apart at any second, they spoke of him like a myth, not with exaggeration, but with reverence, as if they had seen something they could not quite define, and knew they would not see again. The captain of the flight gave one interview, and only one standing on the edge of the airfield, where the aircraft still sat under tarp and floodlight. He said, "There are men who wear uniforms and follow procedure, and then there are men who carry the sky inside them, and when everything else fails, the sky listens to them, and that is who flew my plane. I never saw a finer pilot, and I doubt I ever will again." And after that, he refused to speak on the matter. Further, Elias kept walking until a second truck passed him, slowed and stopped. The driver asked if he needed a ride. Elias nodded and climbed in. They did not talk much. The driver asked, "Where are you headed?" And Elias simply said, "South." The driver nodded and drove the night. Stretched out around them, filled with the hum of tires on pavement and the soft static of a forgotten radio station playing something old, and low and full of silence between the notes. In a small town far from the headlines, a mother sat with her daughter on the porch, both of them wrapped in a blanket watching stars, and the girl whispered, "Do you think he was an angel?" And the mother smiled and said, "No, I think he was just a man, a very good man, and that is even more special." And the girl nodded and closed her eyes and dreamed of gray sweatshirts and hands that never shook. Elias would not read the stories or watch the news. He would not return calls from numbers he did not recognize, and he would not accept invitations or medals or awards. He would simply move on, as he always had, because he had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. It had always been enough. And somewhere in the vastness of quiet roads and long shadows, a man who once flew in war, who once walked away from it, who had nothing to prove and everything to give, kept moving toward whatever waited next, without sound, without spotlight, without regret.